Sometimes the love of a dog is the only thing that keeps us whole when life falls apart. For Lila, her golden retriever Daisy had been that lifeline through 5 years of loneliness and heartbreak. When she felt a small lump on Daisy's side, she took her to the local vet, expecting routine news about a harmless fatty tumor. Asterisk. But young Dr. Ethan decided to run a microchip scan just to be thorough. What he found changed everything. The chip revealed Daisy was actually a missing therapy dog named Honey, who disappeared 12 years ago. A real owner, a widower named Frank, had never stopped searching for the dog who helped him through his wife's death. Now Lila faced an impossible choice between keeping her beloved companion and doing what's right. Asterisk. But how did Honey end up with Lila in the first place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Lila's kitchen window, casting gentle patterns across the worn hardwood floor where Daisy lay stretched out in her favorite spot. At 62, Lila had grown to appreciate these quiet moments. The soft sound of her coffee brewing, the rustle of newspaper pages, and the steady rhythm of Daisy's breathing. These simple pleasures had become the foundation of her carefully reconstructed life. 5 years ago, everything had been different. 5 years ago, she'd been Mrs. Robert Chen, living in a sprawling suburban home with her husband of 28 years, their 2 grown children visiting for holidays, the house alive with conversation and laughter. Now she was simply Lila Chen, occupying a modest 2-bedroom cottage on Maple Street. Her children scattered across the country pursuing their own busy lives, and her ex-husband remarried to someone 15 years younger. The divorce had been brutal in its civility. No screaming matches, no thrown dishes, just the slow, methodical dismantling of a life they built together. Robert had been practical about it, almost businesslike. The house sold, assets divided, custody arrangements made for their adult children's holiday visits as if they were still minors who needed scheduling. What he couldn't divide, couldn't quantify on a legal document, was the loneliness that followed. Those first months alone had been the darkest of Lila's life. She'd moved into the cottage in late September, and by January, the silence had become suffocating. Her daughter Sarah called every Sunday from Seattle, her voice bright and cheerful but distant. Her son Michael sent occasional texts from Chicago, usually photos of his toddler with brief messages like, "Grammy would love this." But love transmitted through phone screens felt hollow, inadequate. It was on one of those gray February mornings, when the loneliness felt particularly heavy, that Lila had found Daisy. Or rather, Daisy had found her. She'd been walking the neighborhood trails, trying to convince herself that exercise might lift her spirits when she spotted the golden retriever huddled beneath a park bench. The dog was painfully thin, her beautiful coat matted and dull, her eyes holding that particular wariness that comes from too many days of uncertainty. A worn red collar hung loose around her neck, but no tags jingled when she moved. "Hey there, sweetheart," Lila had whispered, crouching down and extending her hand. The dog's tail gave the faintest wag, hope flickering in those amber eyes. That was the beginning of everything. Lila had coaxed the stray home with gentle words and half of her turkey sandwich. She'd planned to feed her, clean her up, and take her to the shelter the next day. That was the responsible thing to do. But something about the way Daisy she'd started calling her, Daisy because of her sunny disposition, despite her circumstances, something about the way the dog settled into the cottage, as if she belonged there, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this home, made Lila reconsider. She'd posted flyers around the neighborhood, called the local shelters, even placed an ad in the paper. Found. Golden retriever, friendly female, appears to be middle-aged. Contact Lila if she's yours. But weeks passed with no response. And gradually Lila stopped hoping someone would claim her new companion, Dr. Martinez. The elderly veterinarian who'd been treating pets in their small town for 40 years had examined Daisy and declared her healthy but undernourished. Probably been on her own for a while, he'd said, his weathered hands gentle as he checked her ears and teeth. Lucky you found each other. Sometimes these things are just meant to be. Lila had bought Daisy a proper leather collar, rich brown with small silver studs and a matching leash. She'd spend an afternoon at the pet store, filling a cart with toys, a bed, premium food, and all the supplies a dog could need. It felt good to have someone to care for again, someone who needed her. Over the months that followed, Daisy transformed from a wary stray into a confident, loving companion. Her coat regained its lustrous gold, her eyes brightened with intelligence and affection, and her tail seemed to wag constantly. But more than that, Lila transformed too. The cottage no longer felt empty. Her morning walks became adventures shared with an enthusiastic partner. Her evenings were spent with Daisy's warm presence beside her on the sofa, sometimes watching television, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Daisy was intuitive in the way that good dogs are. When Lila had rough days, and there were still plenty of those, Daisy would rest her head on Lila's lap, offering wordless comfort. When Lila laughed at something on television, Daisy would prance around the living room as if celebrating with her. The dog seemed to understand that her human needed consistent, uncomplicated love. The routine they'd established was precious. To Lila, morning walks around the neighborhood, Daisy greeting other dogs and their owners with friendly enthusiasm. Afternoons in the small backyard, Daisy supervising while Lila tended her vegetable garden. Evenings curled up together, Daisy's steady breathing a lullaby that helped Lila sleep peacefully for the first time since her divorce. Sarah and Michael had been skeptical at first. "Mom, are you sure you want the responsibility of a pet right now?" Sarah had asked during one of their Sunday calls. But when they'd visited last Christmas, they'd both fallen in love with Daisy's gentle nature and obvious devotion to their mother. "She's good for you, Mom," Michael had said, scratching behind Daisy's ears. "I haven't seen you this relaxed in years," and it was true. Daisy had given Lila purpose again. Someone depended on her, needed her care and attention. The dog's unconditional love had slowly healed wounds that Lila hadn't even realized were still bleeding. Now, 5 years later, Lila couldn't imagine her life without Daisy. They were a team, a small family of two who'd found each other when they both needed rescuing. Which was why, when she'd felt that small, firm lump just behind Daisy's front leg during their morning cuddle session, her heart had immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. "It's probably nothing serious," she'd told herself, running her fingers gently over the area. "Just a fatty lump. Old dogs get them all the time." But probably wasn't good enough when it came to Daisy. Lila had called Riverside Veterinary Clinic first thing Monday morning and scheduled an appointment with their newest veterinarian. Dr. Martinez had retired 6 months ago, turning his practice over to a young man fresh out of veterinary school. Dr. Ethan Brooks was probably closer in age to her children than to her, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an earnest manner that immediately put both pets and their owners at ease. He'd moved to their small town from the city, drawn by the idea of a quiet practice where he could really get to know his patients and their families. "Let's take a look at this lump," Dr. Ethan had said when they arrived for their appointment. That Tuesday morning, his hands were gentle but thorough as he examined Daisy, who sat patiently on the metal examination table, trusting these humans who'd always taken good care of her. Lila watched his face carefully, searching for any sign of concern. "It's probably just a fatty tumor, right?" That's what Dr. Martinez always said about these things. Dr. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Lipomas are very common in older dogs, especially golden retrievers. This does feel like it could be one." He paused, continuing his examination. But I'd like to do a few tests, just to be thorough. Sometimes what feels like a simple fatty lump can be something else. What kind of tests? Lila asked, her hand automatically reaching out to stroke Daisy's head. Nothing invasive, Dr. Ethan assured her. I'd like to do a fine needle aspirate, just a tiny sample of the tissue to look at under a microscope. And while we're at it, I'd like to scan for a microchip. I know Daisy's been with you for years, but it's standard practice now, and sometimes chips can migrate or be missed in previous scans. Lila felt her stomach tighten slightly at the mention of a microchip. She'd never had Daisy scanned before when she'd found her. Microchipping wasn't as common, and after all these years, it had never occurred to her to check. Daisy was hers. That was simply the reality they both lived with. Of course, she heard herself saying, whatever you think is best. As Dr. Ethan prepared his equipment, Lila found herself studying Daisy's face. Those intelligent amber eyes, the way her ears perked up at certain sounds, the gentle way she interacted with other dogs and people. After 5 years together, Lila knew every one of Daisy's expressions, every quirk and preference. She knew that Daisy preferred beef to chicken, that she was afraid of thunderstorms but loved snow, that she had an uncanny ability to sense when Lila was feeling sad. This won't hurt, Dr. Ethan said, positioning the microchip scanner over Daisy's shoulders, just like a wand at the grocery store. The scanner beeped once, twice, and then began emitting a rapid, steady beeping sound. Dr. Ethan's eyebrows rose slightly. Well, she definitely has a chip. He adjusted the scanner's position, getting a clear read. Let me just pull up the information. Lila watched as he typed numbers into his computer, her heart beginning to race for reasons she couldn't quite explain. Daisy looked up at her with trusting eyes, tail wagging softly against the examination table. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes as Dr. Ethan stared at his screen. His expression shifted from routine professionalism to confusion, then to something that looked almost like disbelief. Mrs. Chun, he said slowly, his voice careful and measured. I think we need to sit down and talk. The small consultation room felt suddenly airless as Dr. Ethan closed the door behind them. Daisy settled comfortably at Lila's feet, oblivious to the tension crackling between the two humans. Her tail thumped softly against the linoleum floor, a sound that had always brought Lila comfort, but now seemed to echo with ominous undertones. Please, sit down, Dr. Ethan said, his usual easy confidence replaced by careful deliberation. He pulled up a chair across from Lila, the computer screen, angled so she could see it. The microchip information has given us some unexpected results. Lila's hands found their way to Daisy's head, fingers automatically stroking the familiar silk of her ears. What kind of unexpected results? Dr. Ethan took a breath, clearly struggling with how to deliver whatever news he'd discovered. According to the database, Daisy is registered as Honey Morrison. The chip was implanted 12 years ago by a veterinary clinic in Millbrook County. That's about an hour north of here. The words hit Lila like a physical blow. She stared at the screen, seeing the registration details that proved her beloved companion had an entire identity she'd known nothing about. That's impossible. I found her 5 years ago. She was a stray thin, dirty, obviously abandoned. I know this is difficult to process, Dr. Ethan said gently, but there's more. The registration shows that Honey was reported missing in March 2012. Her owner, Frank Morrison, filed a missing pet report that's still active in the system. Lila felt the world tilt slightly. 12 years. Someone had been looking for Daisy for Honey for 12 years. But she was clearly astray when I found her. No one was taking care of her. Dr. Ethan nodded sympathetically. I believe you. Something obviously happened between when she went missing and when you found her. But Mrs. Chun, according to this information, Honey was a certified therapy dog. She was specially trained to work with patients suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's disease. The revelation hit Lila with stunning force. Therapy dog training explained so much about Daisy's intuitive nature, her ability to sense emotions, her gentle way with everyone she met. But it also meant that somewhere out there, someone had invested considerable time, money, and love into training her for a specific purpose. "I need to see more information," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about this Frank Morrison." Dr. Ethan hesitated. "Are you sure? This might be painful to learn." "I need to know." He turned back to his computer and pulled up additional records. Frank Morrison, age 74, lives on rural Route 7 in Millbrook County. According to the missing pet report, Honey disappeared from his property on March 15, 2012. She was 7 years old at the time. He paused, reading further. The report indicates that Honey was his wife's therapy dog, helping her cope with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Lila closed her eyes, trying to process the implications. Somewhere, an elderly man had spent 12 years wondering what happened to his wife's therapy dog. 12 years of checking shelters, posting flyers, hoping for news that never came. "Is there contact information?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "There is, but Mrs. Chun, I think we need to proceed very carefully here. This is an emotionally complex situation for everyone involved." Dr. Ethan was right. Of course, but the practical young veterinarian didn't understand the depth of what he was asking her to consider. Daisy wasn't just her pet, she was her closest companion, her daily comfort, the beating heart of her carefully rebuilt life. "What happens now?" Lila asked. "Legally, I mean. Honestly, I'm not sure about the legal aspects. You found her as a stray and cared for her for 5 years. But if the original owner is still alive and can prove ownership through the microchip and registration..." Dr. Ethan trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. "You think I should contact him?" It wasn't a question. "I think it's the right thing to do," he said quietly. "But I also understand how difficult this must be for you." Lila looked down at Daisy, who gazed back with those trusting amber eyes. How could she explain to this beloved companion that her entire world might be about to change again? How could she make Daisy understand that the humans she depended on were about to make decisions that would affect the rest of her life? "Can I think about this?" Lila asked. "Before we contact anyone?" Dr. Ethan nodded. "Of course. This isn't a decision that should be rushed. But Mrs. Chun, I feel obligated to tell you that I've taken an oath to act in the best interests of the animals in my care. If I believe that returning Honey to her original family is what's best for her, you'll contact them yourself." Lila finished, understanding the position he was in. "I'd prefer to work with you on this. I think the transition, if there is one, would be much easier on everyone if we handle it thoughtfully." As they walked to the car, Daisy trotting happily beside them, Lila felt as though she was moving through a dream. Everything looked the same. The familiar parking lot, the trees lining the street, the small-town storefronts, but her world had fundamentally shifted in the space of 30 minutes. That evening, Lila sat in her living room with Daisy curled up beside her on the sofa, trying to make sense of what she'd learned. She found herself studying her companion with new eyes, searching for signs of the specialized training Dr. Ethan had mentioned. Now that she knew what to look for, the evidence was everywhere. The way Daisy seemed to sense when Lila was upset and would immediately provide comfort. Her unusual calmness around strangers and her gentle approach to children. The way she could settle instantly into a downstay position and remain perfectly still for long periods, not typical behavior for most pets. "You were helping someone before you helped me, weren't you, girl?" Lila whispered, scratching behind Daisy's ears. The dog's tail wagged softly, and she nuzzled closer to Lila's side. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Lila reached for her laptop. If she was going to lose Daisy, she needed to understand who she was losing her to. The internet search for Frank Morrison, Millbrook County, yielded limited results, but what she found painted a picture of a man who had indeed suffered significant loss. A brief obituary from 3 years ago mentioned Margaret Morrison, beloved wife of Frank Morrison, who had passed away after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. The obituary mentioned that Margaret was predeceased by her therapy dog, Honey, who had gone missing several years earlier. Predeceased. Frank Morrison had given up hope that his wife's therapy dog would ever return home. Lila stared at the screen, her heart breaking for this stranger who had endured not just the loss of his wife to a terrible disease, but also the mysterious disappearance of the companion who had helped them both cope. She imagined him as a younger man, perhaps in his early 60s, desperately searching for Honey while simultaneously caring for a wife whose condition was deteriorating. The next morning, Dr. Ethan called just as Lila was finishing her coffee. "Mrs. Chun, I hope you don't mind, but I did some research last night. I found some old missing pet flyers in our clinic files from when Dr. Martinez was still practicing. Frank Morrison posted them all over town 12 years ago." Lila's stomach dropped. "He searched here. It looks like he searched everywhere, within a 100-mile radius. Mrs. Chen, I think you should see these flyers. Would you be willing to come in this afternoon?" An hour later, Lila sat in Dr. Ethan's office, staring at a faded missing pet poster. The photo showed a younger, healthier-looking version of Daisy Honey sitting beside an elderly woman in a wheelchair. The woman's face was kind, but showed the vacant expression that often accompanies advanced dementia. At the bottom of the flyer, in desperate block letters, someone had written, "Please help us find Honey. She's not just our pet, she's my wife's lifeline." "There are dozens of these," Dr. Ethan said quietly. He posted them in every veterinary clinic, pet store, and shelter in a 3-county area. "Look at the reward amount." Lila's eyes widened. $5,000. An elderly man on what was probably a fixed income had offered $5,000 for the return of his wife's therapy dog. "Mrs. Chun, I've made a decision," Dr. Ethan said. "I'm going to drive up to Millbrook County tomorrow to speak with Mr. Morrison in person. This situation is too delicate to handle over the phone. What will you tell him? The truth. That Honey is alive and healthy, and that she's been living with a family who loves her very much, but also that her original family never stopped looking for her." Lila felt tears threatening. "And then what?" "Then we figure out what's best for everyone involved, including Honey." That night, Lila lay awake staring at the ceiling while Daisy slept peacefully beside her. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, a grieving widower would learn that his wife's beloved therapy dog was alive. And Lila would have to face the possibility that doing the right thing might mean breaking her own heart. She reached over and placed her hand on Daisy's warm side, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing. "I love you, sweet girl," she whispered into the darkness. "No matter what happens, I need you to know that these 5 years with you have been the best years of my life." Daisy stirred slightly in her sleep, moving closer to Lila's warmth, trusting and content. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and impossible decisions. But tonight, they were still just Lila and Daisy, a family of 2 who had saved each other from loneliness. Dr. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as he turned onto Rural Route 7. The drive to Millbrook County had given him plenty of time to rehearse what he would say to Frank Morrison. But now that he was actually here, the words felt inadequate. How do you tell a 74-year-old widower that his wife's missing therapy dog, the one he'd assumed was dead, had been living an hour away for the past 5 years? The Morrison property sat at the end of a gravel driveway lined with mature oak trees. The house was a modest ranch-style home, well-maintained but showing its age. A wooden wheelchair ramp led to the front porch, and Dr. Ethan felt his heart clench as he realized it had probably been built for Frank's late wife. Frank Morrison answered the door on the second knock. He was a tall man, slightly stooped with age, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a cardigan despite the mild weather, and there was something about his careful movements that suggested someone who lived alone and had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of solitude. "Mr. Morrison?" "I'm Dr. Ethan Brooks from Riverside Veterinary Clinic. I called yesterday a potentially important information regarding your missing dog." Frank's face immediately transformed, hope and caution warring in his expression. "Please, come in. I'll put on some coffee." The interior of the house told the story of a life that had been lived in partnership and was now being navigated alone. Family photos covered the mantelpiece, Frank and Margaret on their wedding day, vacation pictures from happier times, and prominently displayed several photos of a golden retriever who looked exactly like Daisy. "That's Honey," Frank said, noticing Dr. Ethan's gaze. "Best dog we ever had." Margaret used to say Honey understood her better than most people did. Dr. Ethan accepted a cup of coffee and settled into a well-worn armchair across from Frank. On the side table next to Frank's chair sat a silver medical bracelet, clearly Margaret's, along with what appeared to be Honey's old collar and leash. "Mr. Morrison, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, and I want you to know that I've thought very carefully about how to handle this situation." Frank leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. Did you find her body? After all these years, I just need to know what happened." "No, sir. Honey is alive." The words hung in the air between them. Frank's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, hope, confusion, and finally something that looked like grief mixed with joy. "Alive?" he whispered. "After 12 years? But how, where?" Dr. Ethan took a deep breath. "She's been living with a woman named Lila Chun, about an hour south of here. Mrs. Chun found her as a stray 5 years ago and has been caring for her ever since. She brought Honey to my clinic for a routine examination, and that's when we discovered the microchip." Frank was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. 5 years. She's been alive for 5 years, and I didn't know. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to understand something. Mrs. Chun had no idea Honey belonged to anyone. She found her in rough condition then, obviously, having been on her own for some time. She searched for an owner, posted flyers, contacted shelters. When no one claimed her, Mrs. Chun assumed she was abandoned. What happened to her?" Frank asked. "Between when she disappeared and when this Mrs. Chun found her? We don't know. That's a 7-year gap we can't account for." Frank stood and walked to the mantelpiece, picking up one of the photos of Honey. "She disappeared on March 15th, 2012. I remember because it was the day after Margaret's 72nd birthday. We'd had a small party, just Margaret's sister and her family. Honey had been so good that day, staying right beside Margaret's wheelchair, sensing that she was having one of her better days." He paused, lost in the memory. "That night, I let Honey out for her evening walk around the property. She always came back within 10 minutes. She never wandered far from Margaret. But that night, she just didn't come home." Dr. Ethan watched as Frank's hands trembled slightly holding the photograph. "We searched for weeks. I drove every road in 3 counties, checked every shelter, posted flyers everywhere. I hired a pet detective, if you can believe that. Spent nearly all our savings looking for her. The flyers mentioned a $5,000 reward." Frank nodded. "Money we couldn't really afford to lose, but Margaret was declining so rapidly without Honey. The dog wasn't just a pet. She was Margaret's anchor to reality. When Margaret would get confused or agitated, Honey could calm her down when I couldn't. She'd rest her head in Margaret's lap, and it was like watching a miracle happen. Dr. Ethan found himself deeply moved by the obvious love this man still carried for both his late wife and the missing dog. "Can you tell me about Honey's training?" "Oh, she was special," Frank said, his face lighting up for the first time since Dr. Ethan's arrival. "We got her when Margaret was first diagnosed. The doctor recommended a therapy dog, said it might help slow the progression of symptoms. Honey cost us $8,000, not just for the dog, but for the specialized training." Frank walked to a bookshelf and pulled out a thick folder. I kept all her certificates, all her training records. Honey was trained to recognize the signs of confusion or agitation in dementia patients. She could perform deep pressure therapy, interrupt repetitive behaviors, and provide emotional grounding during episodes. As Frank showed him the documentation, Dr. Ethan began to understand the true magnitude of what had been lost when Honey disappeared. This wasn't just a beloved family pet. She was a highly trained medical companion whose absence had likely affected Margaret's quality of life during her final years. How did Margaret cope after Honey disappeared? Dr. Ethan asked gently. Frank's face crumpled slightly. She didn't understand at first. She kept asking for Honey, and I kept having to explain that she was gone. But Margaret's condition meant she'd forget the explanation and ask again an hour later. It broke my heart to keep telling her over and over that Honey wasn't coming home. "I'm so sorry." Eventually, Margaret's Alzheimer's progressed to the point where she couldn't remember Honey at all. In some ways, that was a mercy. But those first few months without her therapy dog, Frank shook his head. "I think Margaret might have lived longer if Honey had been here." The stress of losing her companion certainly didn't help her condition. Dr. Ethan felt the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. On one side was Frank Morrison, a man who had lost not just his wife, but also the trained companion who might have eased her final years. On the other side was Lila Chun, a woman who had found healing and purpose in caring for a dog she believed was abandoned. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you something difficult. If Honey could be returned to you, would you want her back?" Frank looked at him with surprise. "Of course I would. She's my dog. But more than that, she's my last connection to Margaret. Every day I look at her collar and leash hanging by the door, hoping against hope that someday I'll hear her bark again. She's 11 years old now. She's been with Mrs. Chun for 5 years, more than a third of her life." "I understand that," Frank said quietly. "And I'm grateful, truly grateful, that someone cared for her when I couldn't. But Dr. Brooks, Honey was trained specifically to be my wife's companion. That training doesn't just disappear. She belongs here, with me." As Dr. Ethan prepared to leave, Frank handed him the silver medical bracelet from the side table. This was Margaret's. She wore it every day toward the end, when she couldn't remember her own name sometimes. Honey used to nuzzle it when Margaret was having particularly bad episodes, as if she could smell Margaret's scent on it and knew it was important. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because if you're going to help me get Honey back, I want Mrs. Chun to understand what she meant to our family. This isn't about being selfish or taking away something that brings her joy. This is about bringing home a dog who was trained to heal, who was bred and raised to serve a purpose that's bigger than just being a pet." Dr. Ethan accepted the bracelet, feeling its weight in his palm. "I'll speak with Mrs. Chun, but I want you to understand, this isn't going to be easy for anyone involved. Doctor, I'm 74 years old. My wife is gone, my children live across the country, and most days, the only conversation I have is with the checkout clerk at the grocery store. Honey coming home wouldn't just give me back my dog. She'd give me back a piece of my family." As Dr. Ethan drove away from the Morrison property, Margaret's medical bracelet in his pocket felt like it was burning against his leg. He understood. Now that this situation was far more complex than a simple case of ownership. This was about grief, healing, and the different ways that love can claim the same heart. As Frank showed him the documentation, Dr. Ethan began to understand the true magnitude of what had been lost when Honey disappeared. This wasn't just a beloved family pet. She was a highly trained medical companion whose absence had likely affected Margaret's quality of life during her final years. How did Margaret cope after Honey disappeared? Dr. Ethan asked gently. Frank's face crumpled slightly. She didn't understand at first. She kept asking for Honey, and I kept having to explain that she was gone. But Margaret's condition meant she'd forget the explanation and ask again an hour later. It broke my heart to keep telling her over and over that Honey wasn't coming home. I'm so sorry. Eventually, Margaret's Alzheimer's progressed to the point where she couldn't remember Honey at all. In some ways, that was a mercy. But those first few months without her therapy dog, Frank shook his head. I think Margaret might have lived longer if Honey had been here. The stress of losing her companion certainly didn't help her condition. Dr. Ethan felt the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. On one side was Frank Morrison, a man who had lost not just his wife, but also the trained companion who might have eased her final years. On the other side was Lila Chun, a woman who had found healing and purpose in caring for a dog she believed was abandoned. Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you something difficult. If Honey could be returned to you, would you want her back? Frank looked at him with surprise. Of course I would. She's my dog. But more than that, she's my last connection to Margaret. Every day I look at her collar and leash hanging by the door, hoping against hope that someday I'll hear her bark again. She's 11 years old now. She's been with Mrs. Chun for 5 years, more than a third of her life. I understand that, Frank said quietly. I am grateful, truly grateful, that someone cared for her when I couldn't. But Dr. Brooks, Honey was trained specifically to be my wife's companion. That training doesn't just disappear. She belongs here with me. As Dr. Ethan prepared to leave, Frank handed him the silver medical bracelet from the side table. This was Margaret's. She wore it every day toward the end, when she couldn't remember her own name sometimes. Honey used to nuzzle it when Margaret was having particularly bad episodes, as if she could smell Margaret's scent on it and knew it was important. Why are you giving this to me? Because if you're going to help me get Honey back, I want Mrs. Chun to understand what she meant to our family. This isn't about being selfish or taking away something that brings her joy. This is about bringing home a dog who is trained to heal, who is bred and raised to serve a purpose that's bigger than just being a pet. Dr. Ethan accepted the bracelet, feeling its weight in his palm. I'll speak with Mrs. Chun, but I want you to understand, this isn't going to be easy for anyone involved. Doctor, I'm 74 years old. My wife is gone, my children live across the country, and most days, the only conversation I have is with the checkout clerk at the grocery store. Honey coming home wouldn't just give me back my dog. She'd give me back a piece of my family. As Dr. Ethan drove away from the Morrison property, Margaret's medical bracelet in his pocket felt like it was burning against his leg. He understood. Now that this situation was far more complex than a simple case of ownership. This was about grief, healing, and the different ways that love can claim the same heart. Lila had been pacing her living room for the better part of an hour when Dr. Ethan's car pulled into her driveway. Through the window, she watched him sit in his vehicle for a moment, clearly gathering himself before what he knew would be a difficult conversation. Daisy, sensing her human's agitation, had been following Lila's restless movements with concerned eyes. When the doorbell rang, Daisy immediately went to the door, tail wagging with her usual welcoming enthusiasm. The irony wasn't lost on Lila. Her dog was eager to greet the man who might be about to change both their lives forever. Mrs. Chun, Dr. Ethan said as she opened the door. His expression was somber, and she could see the weight of whatever he'd learned in his shoulders. "Please, call me Lila. Come in." She led him to the living room, where he immediately knelt down to greet Daisy. The dog responded with obvious affection, pressing her head against his hand for scratches. "She's a remarkable animal," he said, settling into the chair across from Lila. "Even more remarkable than I initially realized." Lila felt her stomach tighten. "You met with him?" "With Frank Morrison." "I did." "And Lila, I need to share what I learned, but I want you to know up front that this is going to be painful to hear." For the next 30 minutes, Dr. Ethan recounted his visit with Frank. He told her about the house with the wheelchair ramp, about the photographs of Honey with Margaret, about the $8,000 spent on specialized training. He described Frank's search efforts, the reward money, and most heartbreakingly, Margaret's decline after Honey's disappearance. When he finished, Lila sat in silence, absently stroking Daisy's head. The dog had settled beside her chair, seeming to sense that she needed comfort. "He wants her back," Lila finally said. It wasn't a question. "He does. But Lila, I want you to understand something. He's not some stranger trying to steal your pet. He's a grieving widower who lost his wife's medical companion 12 years ago and has been hoping for her return ever since." Lila stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the small backyard where she and Daisy had spent countless peaceful hours together. "Dr. Ethan, I understand that this man suffered a loss. I truly do, but Daisy has been my family for 5 years. She's seen me through the worst period of my life." "Tell me about that," he said gently. "Help me understand what Daisy means to you." Lila found herself pulling out a cardboard box from her bedroom closet, a box she rarely opened because it contained too many painful memories. She returned to the living room with her divorce papers, spreading them on the coffee table. "This is why I needed her," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My marriage ended after 28 years. Not because of infidelity or abuse, or anything dramatic. It just ended because Robert decided he wanted a different life, and that life didn't include me." Dr. Ethan listened as Lila described the slow dissolution of her marriage, the division of assets, the empty nest that had become unbearably quiet after her children moved away to pursue their own lives. "I was 62 years old, Dr. Ethan. Do you understand what that means for a woman who had defined herself as a wife and mother for her entire adult life? My children were busy with their careers and families. My friends were still married, still part of couples. I felt invisible, unnecessary." She picked up one of the divorce documents, its legal language reducing 28 years of shared life to a simple division of property. "The day these papers were finalized, I came home to this empty house and seriously considered whether anyone would notice if I simply disappeared. Lila, and then I found her." Lila looked down at Daisy, who was watching the conversation, with those intelligent amber eyes. This beautiful, broken creature who needed someone to care for her. For the first time in months, I had a purpose. Someone needed me. Dr. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Margaret's medical bracelet. "Frank asked me to give you this. It belonged to his wife." Lila accepted the bracelet with trembling hands. It was delicate silver, engraved with Margaret's name and medical information. The metal was warm from being in Dr. Ethan's pocket, and she could imagine it resting against an elderly woman's wrist day after day. He said that Honey used to nuzzle this bracelet when Margaret was having particularly difficult episodes. The dog seemed to understand that it was important to her. Lila closed her eyes, feeling the weight of this stranger's grief. "You're asking me to give up the only family I have left for a man I've never met." "I'm not asking you to do anything," Dr. Ethan said carefully. "I'm presenting you with information and hoping that whatever decision you make is one you can live with." "And what about what's best for Daisy?" She's not a piece of property to be passed around. She's 11 years old. Don't you think moving her again, away from the only home she's known for 5 years, might be traumatic? It was a fair point, and Dr. Ethan considered it carefully. That's something I've been thinking about a lot. But Lila, I have to tell you, when I was examining Daisy the other day, I noticed some behaviors that make more sense now that I know about her training. What kind of behaviors? The way she immediately positioned herself at your feet when you became emotional. How she maintained eye contact with you even when I was petting her, monitoring your emotional state. The way she responds to subtle changes in your voice tone and posture. These aren't typical pet behaviors. They're the result of intensive therapy dog training. Lila felt a chill run down her spine. You're saying she's been taken care of me all this time? That it wasn't just natural affection? I think it was both, Dr. Ethan said gently. I think Honey Daisy formed a genuine bond with you. But I also think her training kicked in when she sensed you needed emotional support. She wasn't just being a loving pet. She was doing what she was trained to do. That evening, after Dr. Ethan left, Lila found herself studying Daisy with new awareness. She thought about all the times over the past 5 years when Daisy had seemed to understand exactly what she needed. The way the dog would rest her head in Lila's lap during their Sunday phone calls with Sarah, when Lila often felt the sharp pang of missing her children. How Daisy would refuse to leave her side on the anniversary of her divorce, seeming to sense that particular date was difficult. Have you been working this whole time, sweet girl? Lila asked, scratching behind Daisy's ears. Have you been my therapy dog without either of us really understanding it? Daisy's tail wagged softly, and she pressed closer to Lila's side, a gesture that Lila now recognized as classic emotional support behavior. As she prepared for bed that night, Lila caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked older than her 62 years, worn down by the impossible choice she was facing. In the reflection, she could see Daisy lying on the bathroom rug, watching her with concerned eyes. What am I supposed to do? She whispered to her reflection. How do I choose between my heart and what's right? But as she turned off the lights and settled into bed with Daisy curled up beside her, Lila realized that perhaps the choice wasn't really hers to make. Perhaps, after 5 years of being cared for by a dog trained to heal, she had healed enough to make the choice that love real, selfless love demanded. The thought terrified her, but for the first time since Dr. Ethan's revelation, Lila began to consider what letting go might actually mean. Not just for her, but for a lonely widower who had never stopped hoping his wife's companion would find her way home. Dr. Ethan found himself making the drive to Frank Morrison's house again 3 days later. The elderly man had called that morning, his voice thick with emotion, asking if there had been any developments. When Dr. Ethan explained that Lila was still processing the information, Frank had quietly asked if he might visit again. I understand this is difficult for everyone, Frank had said over the phone. But if you could spare a few more minutes, there are some things about Honey that I think might help Mrs. Chun understand what she means to our family. Now, sitting in Frank's living room again, Dr. Ethan watched as the elderly man carefully lifted a wooden recipe box from the kitchen counter. The box was obviously well used, its corners worn smooth from years of handling. This was Margaret's, Frank said, settling back into his chair with the box cradled in his lap. She collected recipes for 50 years, from her mother, from magazines, from friends. Cooking was her way of showing love. He opened the box, revealing hundreds of index cards covered in elegant handwriting. After her diagnosis, Margaret would get confused about simple things, what day it was, where she'd put her glasses, sometimes even my name, but she could still remember recipes. She'd sit at the kitchen table with this box, reading through the cards, and for a little while, she'd be herself again. Frank pulled out a card covered in flower fingerprints and gentle stains. Honey learned to bring this box to Margaret whenever she started getting agitated. The dog somehow understood that these recipes were important, that they helped Margaret feel grounded. Dr. Ethan studied the recipe card, a simple recipe for oatmeal cookies written in careful script. How did Honey know to do that? Therapy. Dogs are trained to interrupt negative behaviors and redirect attention to positive activities, Frank explained. But Honey went beyond her basic training. She developed an understanding of Margaret's specific needs that was almost supernatural. Frank reached back into the box and pulled out a photograph that had been tucked between the recipe cards. It showed Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, the recipe box open before her, while Honey lay beside her chair with her head resting on Margaret's lap. This was taken about a month before Honey disappeared, Frank said, his voice growing soft. Margaret was having a particularly good day. She'd made a batch of her famous snickerdoodles, and she was writing down the recipe for our daughter-in-law. Look at Honey's expression. Dr. Ethan studied the photograph. Honey's eyes were fixed on Margaret's face, alert and attentive, as if she was monitoring every subtle change in the elderly woman's demeanor. She never stopped watching Margaret, Frank continued. Even when she was sleeping, one ear would always be cocked in Margaret's direction. If Margaret so much as shifted restlessly in her sleep, Honey would be at her bedside within seconds. What specific training did she have? Dr. Ethan asked, genuinely curious about the extent of Honey's capabilities. Frank stood and retrieved a framed certificate from the bookshelf. This is our certification as a medical alert and response therapy dog. She was trained to recognize the early signs of confusion episodes, anxiety attacks, and what the trainer called sundowning, when Alzheimer's patients become agitated. In the late afternoon, he handed Dr. Ethan the certificate, pointing to the detailed list of skills printed at the bottom. Honey could perform deep pressure therapy by laying across Margaret's lap when she was anxious. She could interrupt repetitive behaviors by nudging Margaret's hands or bringing her a toy. She was even trained to find me if Margaret was in distress, and I wasn't in the room. That's remarkable training for any dog. It cost us nearly $10,000 when you factor in the initial purchase, the specialized training, and the ongoing certification requirements, Frank said. Money we scraped together from our retirement savings because the doctor said it might add years to Margaret's quality of life. Frank returned to the recipe box, this time pulling out a small stack of letters held together with a rubber band. These are thank you notes from the nursing home where Honey and Margaret used to volunteer before her condition worsened. Honey would visit other Alzheimer's patients, providing the same comfort to them that she gave Margaret. Dr. Ethan read through several of the letters, each one describing how Honey's visits had brought moments of clarity and peace to patients who rarely experienced either. One letter, from a woman whose husband was in the advanced stages of dementia, described how Honey had somehow sensed that the man was a former farmer and had brought him a stuffed animal shaped like a cow. For the first time in months, the man had smiled and spoken his first coherent words in weeks. She wasn't just Margaret's therapy dog, Frank said quietly. She was helping an entire community of people dealing with this terrible disease. What happened the night she disappeared? Dr. Ethan asked. You mentioned it was March 15th. Frank's face clouded with the memory. It had been a good day, Margaret's 72nd birthday. Her sister had visited with her grandchildren, and Margaret had been more like herself than she'd been in months. We'd had dinner, opened presents, and Margaret had even managed to help blow out her birthday candles. He paused, staring at the recipe box as if it might hold answers to questions that had haunted him for 12 years. Around 8 o'clock, I led Honey out for her evening walk. She had a routine. She patrolled the perimeter of our property, checking on the chickens, making sure everything was secure. She never wandered beyond our fence line, and she was always back within 10 minutes. But that night was different. I waited 15 minutes, then 20. I started calling for her, walking the property with a flashlight. Margaret was getting agitated because she could sense something was wrong, but she couldn't understand what had happened to Honey. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he continued. I searched until nearly midnight. The next morning, I expanded the search to our neighbors' properties, then to the surrounding woods. It was like she had just vanished into thin air. Did you ever find any clues about what might have happened? Nothing concrete. One of our neighbors thought they might have heard a car door slam around the time Honey went missing, but they couldn't be sure. The sheriff suggested that someone might have picked her up, thinking she was a stray, but Honey was wearing her collar with our contact information. Dr. Ethan felt a chill as he considered the implications. You think someone took her deliberately? I've wondered about that for 12 years, Frank said. A dog with that level of training, that breed, that temperament, she would have been valuable to the wrong person. But I never had any proof, and the sheriff couldn't investigate a theft without evidence. As Dr. Ethan prepared to leave, Frank walked him to the door, carrying one of the photographs of Honey and Margaret. Doctor, I want you to give this to Mrs. Chun, not to make her feel guilty, but to help her understand that Honey wasn't just a pet to us. She was Margaret's medical companion, trained specifically to help people with dementia. When she disappeared, it wasn't just our hearts that broke. Margaret lost a piece of her treatment. I'll make sure she sees it, Dr. Ethan promised. And doctor, I want Mrs. Chun to know that I don't blame her for loving Honey. How could anyone not love that dog? But I've spent 12 years wondering if Margaret might have lived longer, suffered less, if Honey had been there during her final months. I need to know that Honey's training isn't going to waste, that she's fulfilling the purpose she was bred and trained for. As Dr. Ethan drove back toward town, Frank's words echoed in his mind. This wasn't just about returning a lost pet to its owner. It was about a specially trained medical companion who had been stolen from a family who desperately needed her services. But it was also about Lila, who had unknowingly benefited from those same therapeutic skills and who now faced losing the companion who had helped her rebuild her life. The photograph of Honey and Margaret sat on his passenger seat, a tangible reminder that sometimes doing the right thing required breaking someone's heart. The question was whose heart would be broken, and whether any of them could live with the consequences of their choices. Lila stared at the photograph Dr. Ethan had brought her, her hands trembling as she took in every detail. Margaret Morrison sat in her wheelchair, her face showing the gentle confusion of advancing dementia, while Honey, her Daisy, lay beside her with an expression of complete devotion and alertness. The love between the woman and dog was unmistakable, captured in a single frozen moment that spoke of years of partnership. She looks so young here, Lila whispered, studying Honey's face in the photograph, and so focused on Margaret. Frank said, this was taken about a month before she disappeared, Dr. Ethan said, gently. He wanted you to see the bond they shared. Lila set the photograph on her coffee table, unable to look at it any longer. The evidence of Honey's previous life was becoming overwhelming, and each new piece of information made her own claim to the dog feel more tenuous. Dr. Ethan, can I ask you something as a veterinarian? Be honest with me, do you think Daisy remembers her training? Dr. Ethan considered the question carefully. I think you should try some basic commands and see how she responds. Therapy dogs retain their training for years, especially commands that were reinforced daily. That evening, after Dr. Ethan left, Lila found herself studying Daisy with new eyes. She thought back over their 5 years together, remembering moments that had seemed like natural dog behavior, but might have been something more deliberate. "The Daisy," she said softly, and the dog immediately looked up from her spot on the rug. "Let's try something." Lila sat down in her armchair, and deliberately slumped forward, covering her face with her hands in a posture of distress. Within seconds, Daisy was at her side, pressing her warm body against Lila's legs and resting her head on Lila's lap. "Deep pressure therapy," Lila whispered, remembering the term from Dr. Ethan's explanation of Honey's training. This wasn't just comfort. It was a trained response to signs of emotional distress. She tried another test. "Daisy, find my phone," she said, even though she knew exactly where it was on the kitchen counter. To her amazement, Daisy immediately stood, walked to the kitchen, and returned with the phone gently held in her mouth. Lila's heart sank. How many times over the years had she asked Daisy to find things, assuming the dog had simply learned through repetition? Now she realized that Honey had been trained to retrieve specific items for patients who might become confused about where they'd left important objects. The next morning, Lila called her daughter Sarah in Seattle. She needed to talk to someone who would understand the magnitude of what she was facing, even if that person might not give her the answer she wanted to hear. "Mom, that's incredible," Sarah said after Lila explained the situation. "I mean, it's heartbreaking, but also kind of amazing that Daisy was this trained therapy dog all along. I don't know what to do, sweetheart. She's been my whole world for 5 years." "I know, Mom, but can I ask you something? When you were going through the divorce, and you were so depressed that I was worried about you, do you think you would have healed as well without Daisy?" Lila considered the question. "Probably not. She gave me a reason to get up every morning, to take care of something other than myself. So she did exactly what she was trained to do. She helped you heal. But now I'm supposed to give her up." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Mom, remember what you taught me and Michael when we were kids? About doing the right thing even when it's hard? This is different, Sarah, is it? You found a lost dog and cared for her when she needed help. Now you've found her original family, and maybe it's time to help her go home." After the call with Sarah, Lila felt more conflicted than ever. She understood intellectually that returning Honey to Frank was probably the right thing to do. But emotionally, the thought of losing Daisy felt like facing another devastating loss. That afternoon, she made a decision that she knew was probably selfish but felt necessary. She would drive to Millbrook County and see Frank Morrison for herself. She needed to look this man in the eye and understand what she would be giving Daisy up for. She loaded Daisy into her car, telling herself she was just going for a drive. But as she turned onto rural Route 7, her heart began racing. What was she doing? What if Frank saw Daisy and demanded her back immediately? What if seeing her original owner triggered memories in Daisy that would make her want to stay? Lila parked at the end of Frank's driveway, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she watched the modest ranch house. She could see Frank working in his front yard, trimming bushes with the careful movements of a man who had all the time in the world and few people to share it with. As she watched, Frank straightened and looked in her direction. Even from a distance, she could see the moment he spotted the golden retriever in her passenger seat. His entire body went rigid, and then he dropped his gardening shears and started walking toward her car. Lila's first instinct was to drive away, but something in Frank's careful approach stopped her. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. When he reached her car, he knelt down beside the passenger window where Daisy sat. "Hello, honey," he said softly, his voice breaking. On the name, Daisy's reaction was immediate and undeniable. Her ears perked forward, her tail began wagging frantically, and she started whining a sound Lila had never heard her make before. It was the sound of recognition, of joy, of a dog who remembered the voice of someone she loved. Lila felt her heart breaking as she watched the reunion through her car window. She rolled down the passenger side window, and Frank slowly extended his hand. Daisy immediately pressed her nose against his palm, her whole body wiggling with excitement. "She remembers you," Lila said, her voice barely audible. Frank looked up at her for the first time, tears streaming down his face. "Mrs. Chun?" "Yes. Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for taking care of her all these years." Lila got out of the car and walked around to where Frank was still kneeling beside Daisy. The dog was torn between the two humans she loved, looking back and forth between them with obvious confusion. "She's been a wonderful companion," Lila said, fighting back tears. "I can see why you missed her so much." Frank stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Daisy's face. "Would you like to come inside? I'd like to show you some things about Honey, about who she was before." For the next hour, Lila sat in Frank's living room while he shared stories about Honey's life with Margaret. He showed her training videos of a younger Honey learning to respond to specific commands, photographs of Honey working with other dementia patients, and the framed certificate that proved her specialized training. She was more than a pet, Frank said, showing Lila a thick folder of documentation. She was Margaret's medical equipment, as essential as her wheelchair or her medications. As Lila prepared to leave, Frank walked her to the car. "Mrs. Chun, I want you to know that I don't expect you to just hand her over. This is a difficult situation for everyone involved, but I hope you'll consider what would be best for Honey." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Honey was trained to help people who are suffering. She's been helping you for 5 years, which tells me you needed her services. But I'm 74 years old, and I'm alone. I could use her help too." As Lila drove home, Daisy unusually quiet in the passenger seat, she realized that Frank had given her the most compelling argument yet for returning. Honey, it wasn't about ownership or legal rights. It was about purpose. Honey had been bred and trained to serve, to heal, to provide comfort to people who needed it most. And perhaps, after 5 years of healing, Lila was strong enough to let her go. Doctor Ethan had been having trouble sleeping since his last visit with Frank Morrison. Something about the timeline of Honey's disappearance kept nagging at him, a detail that didn't quite fit. He'd found himself at the clinic early that morning, pulling out the old files that Dr. Martinez had left behind. When he retired, the filing system was methodical but outdated, with patient records dating back decades, stored in metal cabinets in the clinic's basement. Dr. Ethan wasn't sure what he was looking for exactly, but his instincts told him there was more to Honey's story than anyone realized. It was in a box labeled Miscellaneous 2017 that he found in a veterinary record that made his blood run cold. The file was thin, containing only a single examination report dated March 20th, 2017. The patient was listed as Daisy Golden Retriever, approximately 10 years old. The owner was listed as Robert Chun, and the reason for the visit was noted as pre-adoption health check. Dr. Ethan stared at the document, his mind racing. March 2017 was exactly when Lila had found Daisy, but according to this record, it wasn't Lila who had brought the dog in for her first examination. It was her ex-husband Robert. The examination notes were brief but telling. Well cared for adult female. Shows signs of previous professional training. Owner reports finding. Dog as stray but wants thorough health check before giving to ex-wife as companion animal. Microchip detected, but owner requests no scan, says he doesn't want a complicated situation if dog was abandoned. Dr. Ethan read the notes 3 times, each reading making him feel sicker. Robert Chun had found Honey, brought her to Dr. Martinez for a health check, specifically requested that the microchip not be scanned, and then given her to Lila as if he'd simply found a stray dog. But it got worse. At the bottom of the file was a receipt for services that made Dr. Ethan's hands shake with anger. Among the standard examination fees was a charge for microchip deactivation consultation. Dr. Martinez had apparently advised Robert on how to have the chip deactivated in another facility. The implications hit Dr. Ethan like a physical blow. Robert Chun had found Honey probably shortly after she disappeared from Frank's property and had deliberately concealed her identity. He'd had her microchip deactivated and then presented her to his ex-wife as a found stray. Knowing that Lila was struggling with depression after their divorce, Dr. Ethan immediately called Lila, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Lila, I need you to come to the clinic right away, and I need you to bring any paperwork you have from when you first adopted Daisy. Is something wrong? Is she sick? Just please come. And Lila, this is important. I need you to tell me everything you remember about how you acquired Daisy. Every detail, especially anything involving your ex-husband." An hour later, Lila sat in Dr. Ethan's office, her face pale as she listened to him read from the veterinary record he'd discovered. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I found her in the park. She was alone, obviously abandoned. Lila, think carefully. Did Robert know you were walking in that park regularly?" "Of course. He did. It was part of my routine after the divorce. He knew I walked there every morning because I'd mentioned it during our settlement meetings." Lila's voice grew smaller as the implications began to dawn on her. "You're saying he put her there? That he knew I would find her?" Dr. Ethan handed her the veterinary record. "According to this, he brought her here 5 days before you found her. He specifically requested that Dr. Martinez not scan her microchip, and he paid for a consultation on having it deactivated." Lila stared at the document, her hands trembling. "He gave her to me knowing she belonged to someone else. It appears that way. And Lila, there's more. I called the facility where the microchip deactivation was done. They have a record of the procedure being performed on March 22, 2017, 2 days after Robert brought Honey here." The room fell silent except for the sound of Lila's ragged breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with a mixture of betrayal and dawning horror. "He was trying to ease his guilt," she said quietly. "About the divorce, about leaving me alone. He thought giving me a dog would somehow make up for destroying our marriage. But he had to know this dog belonged to someone. Robert never cared about consequences if they didn't affect him directly," Lila said bitterly. "He'd probably convinced himself that if the dog was wandering loose, the owners didn't deserve her." Dr. Ethan watched as Lila processed the full magnitude of her ex-husband's deception. "Lila, this changes everything. You didn't unknowingly adopt. A stray, you received stolen property. Frank Morrison's wife lost her therapy dog because your ex-husband decided to use her as a guilt gift." Lila stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot where Daisy waited in her car. "All these years, I thought she was mine. I thought fate had brought us together when we both needed each other most. In a way, fate did bring you together. You saved her life, Lila. Whatever happened between when she disappeared from Frank's property and when Robert found her, you gave her 5 years of love and safety, but she was never really mine." "No," Dr. Ethan said. Gently, "she wasn't." Lila turned back to face him, tears streaming down her face. "Dr. Ethan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. If I keep her now, knowing what I know, what kind of person does that make me?" Dr. Ethan had been dreading this question, but he knew there was only one answer he could give. "It would make you someone who chose her own happiness over doing what's right. And if I give her back to Frank, it would make you someone who chose to do the right thing despite the personal cost." That evening, Lila sat in her living room, with Daisy curled up beside her, both of them surrounded by the evidence of Robert's deception. She had called her ex-husband and confronted him about the veterinary records. His response had been exactly what she'd expected: defensive, dismissive, and ultimately unrepentant. She was just wandering around some old man's property, Robert had said. I figured he wasn't taking proper care of her, or she wouldn't have been loose. You needed a companion, so I solved two problems at once. Robert, that dog was that man's wife's medical companion. When you took her, you took away something that was helping a woman with Alzheimer's disease. How was I supposed to know that? She looked like a regular dog to me. Lila had hung up on him, finally understanding the full extent of the man she'd been married to for 28 years. He had stolen someone's beloved pet, had her identity erased, and given her away like a piece of property, all to assuage his own guilt about ending their marriage. But Robert's motivations didn't change the fundamental reality. Honey belonged with Frank Morrison. She had been stolen from him, and now she needed to go home. Lila looked down at Daisy, who was watching her with those intelligent amber eyes. I'm so sorry, sweet girl, she whispered. I'm sorry that the man I was married to put us both in this impossible situation. Daisy moved closer, pressing her warm body against Lila's side in the gesture of comfort that had sustained her through 5 years of healing. But now Lila understood that this wasn't just natural dog behavior, it was the result of intensive training designed to help humans through their darkest moments. And perhaps, Lila realized, Honey had done exactly what she was trained to do. She had helped Lila heal from the trauma of her divorce, had given her purpose and companionship when she needed it most. Now it was time for Honey to return to her original mission, providing comfort to someone else who needed her specialized skills. The decision, when it finally came, felt both devastating and liberating. Lila would call Dr. Ethan in the morning and arrange for Honey's return to Frank Morrison. She would do the right thing, even though it meant breaking her own heart. Because that's what love sometimes required, letting go of what you treasured most so that it could fulfill its true purpose. Dr. Ethan answered his phone on the first ring when Lila called the next morning. He had been expecting her call, hoping for it, but also dreading what it might mean for all of them. Dr. Ethan, I made my decision, Lila said, her voice steady, despite the obvious emotion behind it. I want to return Honey to Frank Morrison. Are you sure? This isn't a decision you can easily undo, I'm sure. But I need your help to do this right. I don't want to just drop her off and disappear. I want to make sure the transition is as smooth as possible for everyone, especially for Honey. Dr. Ethan felt a mixture of relief and sadness wash over him. What do you have in mind? I want to meet with Frank again, but this time officially. I want to understand what Honey's life will be like with him, and I want him to understand what she's been through with me. Can you arrange that? Of course. When would you like to do this? Lila was quiet for a moment. Soon, before I lose my courage. That afternoon, Dr. Ethan called Frank Morrison with the news. The elderly man's reaction was immediate and emotional, a mixture of joy, relief, and concern for Lila's sacrifice. Doctor, I want Mrs. Chun to know how grateful I am, Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. I know this can't be easy for her. She's requesting a meeting before the transfer. She wants to make sure Honey will be properly cared for. Of course, I'd welcome the chance to talk with her. And Doctor, I have something I'd like to share with both of you. Something Margaret wrote before she died. Dr. Ethan arranged for the meeting to take place at his clinic the following evening. Neutral ground where both parties could speak freely without the emotional weight of being in either of their homes. He spent the intervening day preparing for what he knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of his career. When Lila arrived at the clinic that evening with Honey, Dr. Ethan could see the toll the decision had taken on her. She moved with the careful control of someone, holding herself together through sheer force of will. Honey, sensing her human's distress, stayed close to Lila's side, occasionally pressing against her legs in the comforting gesture that had become second nature. Frank arrived a few minutes later, carrying a small manila envelope and moving with the nervous energy of someone about to receive the answer to 12 years of prayers. When he saw Honey, his face lit up with such pure joy that Dr. Ethan felt his own eyes fill with tears. "Hello, Honey," Frank said softly, crouching down to the dog's level. Honey immediately went to him, her tail wagging frantically, her whole body wiggling with recognition and excitement. "She definitely remembers you," Lila said, her voice carefully controlled. "Thank you," Frank said, looking up at Lila while continuing to pet Honey. "Mrs. Chung, I can't begin to express how grateful I am for what you're doing. I know this must be incredibly difficult." Lila nodded, unable to trust her voice for a moment. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush. "I need to know that she'll be happy with you. I need to know that you understand what she needs, how she likes to be cared for. Tell me," Frank said simply. "Tell me everything." For the next hour, Lila shared 5 years of accumulated knowledge about Honey's preferences, habits, and personality quirks. She explained how Honey liked her food served slightly warmed, never cold from the refrigerator. How she preferred to sleep on the right side of the bed, always touching her human but never demanding to be on top of the covers. How she could sense thunderstorms hours before they arrived and would need extra comfort during the bad weather. Frank listened to every detail with the attention of someone memorizing sacred text. "She still doesn't like loud noises," he noted when Lila mentioned Honey's fear of thunderstorms. "That never changed." "You said you had something to share with us?" Dr. Ethan prompted gently. Frank reached for the manila envelope he brought. Before Margaret died, during one of her last lucid periods, she wrote some letters. One of them was about Honey. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, the handwriting shaky but clearly formed. She wrote this about 6 months before she passed away, during a week when her memory was unusually clear. "I'd like to read it to you, if that's all right." Lila nodded, her hand automatically reaching down to stroke Honey's head. Frank cleared his throat and began to read, "My dearest Honey, if you're hearing this letter, it means you've found your way home at last. I know you've been gone for so long, and I know Frank has been heartbroken without you. But I want you to know that I understand you had work to do somewhere else." His voice broke slightly, but he continued, "You were trained to help people who were suffering, and I have to believe that wherever you've been doing exactly that. You've been healing someone who needed you, just like you healed me during my darkest days." Lila felt tears streaming down her face as Frank read his late wife's words. "I want you to know that the love you gave me, the comfort you provided when my mind was failing me, was the greatest gift I ever received. You helped me remember who I was when I couldn't remember my own name. You gave Frank strength when he needed to care for both of us. And now, I hope you can give him comfort in his loneliness." Frank paused, his own voice thick with emotion. "But mostly, Honey, I want you to know that if you helped someone else the way you helped me, then your time away wasn't lost. It was just another chapter in your life of service. Welcome home, sweet girl. Take care of Frank for me." The room fell silent except for the soft sound of Honey's tail thumping against the floor. She seemed to sense the emotional weight of the moment, looking back and forth between the 3 humans who clearly loved her. "She knew," Lila whispered. Somehow, Margaret knew that Honey was out there helping someone else. Margaret always said that Honey was too special to be gone forever, Frank said. She believed that good things find their way back to where they belong, even if it takes time. Dr. Ethan watched as Lila processed Margaret's words. He could see the shift in her expression, the way the letter seemed to reframe her entire relationship with Honey. Instead of feeling like she was losing something that belonged to her, she was beginning to understand that she had been part of Honey's larger purpose all along. "When do you want to make the transfer?" Dr. Ethan asked gently. Lila looked down at Honey, who was now lying with her head across both Lila's and Frank's feet, as if trying to bridge the gap between her two families. "I'd like a few more days to prepare her and myself. But, Frank, I want you to visit us at my house tomorrow. I want Honey to see us together, to understand that this transition is happening with my blessing." "I'd be honored," Frank said. "And I want to visit her sometimes, if that's all right. Not often, and not in a way that would confuse her, but just to know that she's happy." Frank's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Chen, Lila, you'll always be welcome in our home. You're part of Honey's family now, whether she lives with you or with me." As they prepared to leave the clinic, Dr. Ethan felt a profound sense of privilege at having witnessed something rare and beautiful. People choosing to do what was right despite the personal cost. He watched Lila kneel down to hug Honey one more time, whispering words of love and reassurance into the dog's ear. "It's going to be okay, sweet girl," Lila said softly. "You're going home. And I'm going to be okay too, because you taught me how to be strong." Tomorrow would bring the beginning of the end of their life together. But tonight, Lila and Honey would have one last evening as a family of two, cherishing the bond that had saved them both. The morning of Frank's visit to Lila's house dawned gray and overcast, matching the somber mood that had settled over both households. Lila had barely slept, spending most of the night watching Honey's peaceful breathing and trying to memorize every detail of their last days together. Frank arrived at precisely 10 o'clock, carrying a small canvas bag that he held carefully against his chest. Dr. Ethan had offered to facilitate the visit, understanding that the emotional weight of the day might be too much for either party to handle alone. "Good morning, Lila," Frank said softly as she opened the door. Honey immediately appeared at Lila's side, her tail wagging as she recognized Frank's voice. "Please, come in," Lila said, stepping aside to let both men enter her modest living room. She had spent the morning cleaning and organizing, needing something to occupy her hands while her heart prepared for what was coming. Frank settled into the chair that Dr. Ethan had occupied during his previous visits, while Honey took her customary position between the two humans she loved. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, her usual exuberant greeting replaced by calm attentiveness. "I brought something," Frank said, reaching into his canvas bag. "I've been saving it for 12 years, hoping for this day." He pulled out a well-worn tennis ball, its bright yellow color faded to a pale cream. The ball was obviously old, with teeth marks and scuff marks that spoke of countless games of fetch and hours of faithful companionship. "This was Honey's favorite toy when she lived with Margaret and me," Frank explained, holding the ball carefully in his palm. "She carried it everywhere, to training sessions, to the nursing home visits, even to bed some nights when Margaret was having particularly difficult episodes." Lila watched as Honey's eyes immediately focused on the ball. The dog's entire body went rigid with attention, her ears perked forward in a way that Lila had never seen before. "I wanted to see if she remembers," Frank said quietly. "Not as a test of ownership, but as a way to understand if she still carries the memories of her first family." Frank held up the ball, and Honey's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. She began to whine, the same sound of recognition she had made when she first saw Frank through Lila's car window. Her tail wagged frantically, and she looked back and forth between Frank and the ball with an expression of pure joy. "Honey, do you remember this?" Frank asked gently, his voice taking on the tone of someone speaking to a beloved family member. After a long absence, Honey's response broke Lila's heart and healed it simultaneously. The dog carefully approached Frank, her movements deliberate and almost reverent. She touched her nose to the ball, then sat perfectly still in front of Frank, her eyes fixed on his face with complete attention. "She's waiting for permission," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. She always waited for permission before taking her toy. "Permission for what?" Lila asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Watch," Frank said, holding the ball slightly above Honey's head. "Honey, gentle." Honey immediately opened her mouth and allowed Frank to place the ball between her teeth. But instead of claiming it, she held it delicately, waiting for further instruction. "Good girl, honey. Now give it to Margaret," Frank said, and then caught himself. Give it to Lila." Without hesitation, Honey turned and walked to Lila, gently placing the ball in her lap. Then she returned to Frank and sat again, tail wagging with the satisfaction of a job well done. Lila stared at the ball in her lap, understanding the profound significance of what she had just witnessed. She was trained to bring Margaret her toys when she needed comfort. Among other things, Frank said, Margaret would get agitated sometimes, especially in the evenings. Honey learned that bringing her the tennis ball would help redirect her attention to something positive. Dr. Ethan had been watching the interaction with professional fascination. That's remarkably sophisticated behavior. She remembered not just the object, but the entire behavioral chain associated with it. Honey was special even among therapy. "Dogs," Frank said, his eyes never leaving the golden retriever who sat between them like a bridge connecting two chapters of her life. Her trainer said she had an intuitive understanding of human emotion that couldn't be taught. It was just part of who she was. Lila picked up the tennis ball, studying its worn surface. "How many hours do you think she played with this?" "Thousands," Frank said without hesitation. Margaret would throw it for her in the backyard during her good days. When Margaret couldn't throw anymore, I would do it while she watched from her wheelchair. Even after Margaret stopped recognizing me, she would smile when she saw Honey playing with that ball. As if sensing that she was being discussed, Honey stood and walked to Lila, resting her head on Lila's knee in the gesture of comfort that had become so familiar over their 5 years together. "She's trying to take care of both of us," Lila observed, stroking Honey's silky ears. "That's what she does," Frank agreed. "She reads the emotional temperature of a room and responds accordingly. Right now, she can sense that we're all struggling with difficult feelings." Dr. Ethan leaned forward in his chair. "Frank, can I ask you about Honey's adjustment period? When you take her home, what should we expect in terms of her settling in?" Frank considered the question carefully. Therapy dogs are trained to be adaptable, but they're also creatures of routine. Honey will need time to reestablish her old patterns while adapting to how I've changed in the 12 years she's been gone. "How have you changed?" Lila asked, genuinely curious about the man who would soon be caring for her beloved companion. Frank smiled sadly. "I'm older, obviously, slower. I don't have Margaret to care for anymore, which means my daily routine is much different than it was when Honey lived with me before. I worry sometimes that she'd be bored without the structure that Margaret's needs provided." "What was her routine like before?" Dr. Ethan asked. "She was working constantly," Frank explained, monitoring Margaret's condition, responding to her needs, providing comfort during difficult episodes. On good days, she'd help Margaret with physical therapy exercises. On bad days, she'd simply provide a calming presence. It was a full-time job. Lila felt a pang of concern. And now she'd be caring for one lonely old man instead of a couple dealing with Alzheimer's disease. It might take her some time to adjust to having less intensive work to do. "Maybe that's what she needs," Lila said thoughtfully. "Maybe after all these years of intensive care, first with Margaret, then with me during my depression, maybe she's earned some rest." Frank looked at her with surprise. "You think Honey was providing therapy services to you?" Dr. Ethan helped me understand that Honey's behavior with me wasn't just normal pet affection. She was responding to my emotional needs with the same training she used with Margaret. In a way, I was another patient. The three of them sat in contemplative silence, watching Honey move between them, touching each person briefly as if reassuring herself that they were all still there. "She's going to miss you," Frank said to Lila. just as much as you're going to miss her. I know, Lila whispered, but she belongs with you. Margaret's letter made me understand that Honey's time with me was just another chapter in her life of service. Now it's time for her to come home and help you heal from losing Margaret. Frank reached into his bag again and pulled out a new collar-rich brown leather with brass fittings, obviously expensive and carefully chosen. I bought this for her years ago, hoping for this day. But I want her to keep wearing the collar. You gave her for as long as she's comfortable with it. I don't want to erase the life you built together. Lila touched the familiar collar around Honey's neck, the one she had chosen with such care 5 years ago when she thought she was simply providing for a rescued stray. Thank you for understanding that she had a life with me too. Lila, can I ask you something? Frank said gently. After Honey comes home with me, what will you do? How will you cope with the adjustment? It was a question Lila had been avoiding, even in her own thoughts. I don't know, she admitted. Daisy, honey, has been my world for 5 years. I'll have to learn how to live alone again. Frank was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised both Lila and Dr. Ethan. What if you didn't have to? Lila stared at Frank, uncertain she had heard him correctly. What do you mean? Frank's weathered hand smoothed over Honey's fur as he gathered his thoughts. I mean that maybe Honey isn't the only one who needs to come home. Maybe there's room in this story for all of us to find what we need. Dr. Ethan watched the exchange with growing understanding, sensing that Frank was about to propose something that could change everything for all of them. I've been thinking about this since our conversation at the clinic, Frank continued. Honey thrived when she had important work to do, caring for Margaret, then caring for you. She's a dog who needs purpose, who needs people to help. I don't understand what you're suggesting, Lila said, though something in Frank's tone made her heart beat faster. Frank reached into his bag one more time and pulled out a new dog collar, the brown leather one he had mentioned, but Lila could now see it had a brass nameplate attached. Instead of reading Honey Morrison, it read simply Honey Therapy Dog. What if Honey didn't have to choose between families? Frank asked gently. What if instead of losing each other, we all found a way to be part of her life? Lila felt tears starting to flow. Frank, I can't ask you to share her. She's your dog, your wife's dog. You've waited 12 years for her to come home. And she is coming home, Frank said firmly. But Lila, you've been her family for 5 years. You've loved her and cared for her when I couldn't. In my book, that makes you family too. Dr. Ethan leaned forward, intrigued by the direction the conversation was taking. What exactly are you proposing, Frank? I'm proposing that Honey comes home to live with me, but that Lila becomes part of our extended family. I'm 74 years old, living alone in a house that's too big for one person. Lila, you're facing the prospect of going back to an empty house after 5 years of companionship. Frank paused, looking directly at Lila. What if you visited regularly? What if you helped me care for Honey, and she helped both of us cope with the loneliness we've been carrying? Lila was quiet for a long moment, processing the unexpected offer. You would want that? Even though I kept your dog for 5 years. Without knowing she was yours? Lila, you didn't keep my dog, you saved her life. And more than that, you loved her the way Margaret and I loved her. That doesn't make you a thief, it makes you family. Honey, as if sensing that the conversation was about her future, stood and moved to the center of the room. She sat down and looked at each human in turn, her tail wagging slowly, her expression alert and hopeful. Look at her, Dr. Ethan said softly. She knows something important is happening. Frank knelt down beside Honey and gently removed Lila's collar, replacing it with the new brown leather one. But instead of discarding Lila's collar, he handed it back to her. Keep this, he said. When you visit, you can put it on her so she knows she's with her second family. Lila accepted the familiar collar with trembling hands. "You really mean this? You want me to be part of her life?" "I want what's best for Honey," Frank said simply. "And what's best for Honey is having all the people who love her remain in her life." The formal transfer happened with surprising gentleness. Frank attached Honey's new leash to her new collar, but instead of immediately leading her away, he handed the leash to Lila. "Would you like to walk her to my car?" he asked. "I think it would help her understand that this transition has your blessing." The short walk from Lila's front door to Frank's car felt both eternal and far too brief. Honey trotted beside them, with her usual confidence, seeming to understand that this was a significant moment, but not showing any signs of distress. When they reached the car, Frank opened the passenger door and patted the seat. "Come on, Honey. Time to go home." Honey jumped into the car with the ease of a dog who had made this journey many times before. But instead of settling immediately, she turned to look at Lila through the open door, her tail wagging uncertainly. "It's okay, sweet girl," Lila said, reaching in to stroke Honey's head one last time. "You're going home. And I'll see you very soon." Frank started the engine, then rolled down the passenger window so Honey could see Lila clearly. "I'll call you tomorrow," he promised. "We'll set up a visiting schedule that works for everyone." As Frank's car disappeared down the street, Lila stood in her driveway, holding Honey's old collar and feeling an unexpected sense of peace. She had lost her daily companion, but she had gained something she hadn't expected, a new family connection and the knowledge that love, when freely given, multiplied rather than diminished. Dr. Ethan, who had witnessed the entire exchange, put a gentle hand on Lila's shoulder. "How are you feeling?" "Sad," Lila admitted, "but also hopeful. Frank didn't just take Honey away from me. He invited me to be part of something bigger." "That's a remarkable man," Dr. Ethan observed. "They both are," Lila said, looking at Honey's collar in her hands. "Margaret wrote in her letter that good things find their way back to where they belong. I think maybe that includes people, not just dogs." As they walked back toward Lila's house, she found herself thinking about the future differently than she had in years. Instead of dreading empty days and quiet evenings, she was looking forward to visiting Honey, to getting to know Frank better, to being part of a small but loving family that had been brought together by a dog who specialized in healing broken hearts. "Dr. Ethan," she said as they reached her front door, "thank you for helping us do this right, for making sure everyone's needs were considered." "Thank you for trusting me," he replied, "and for showing me what it looks like when people choose love over ownership." That evening, Lila sat in her living room, quiet now without the sound of Honey's breathing, and began planning her first visit to Frank's house. She had called him an hour after he left, and they had arranged for her to come by the following Sunday for dinner. "I want to see how she's settling in," Lila had explained. "She'd like that," Frank had replied, "and so would I." As Lila prepared for bed that night, she realized that for the first time since Dr. Ethan's revelation about Honey's true identity, she felt genuinely happy about the future. She had done the right thing, and somehow, doing the right thing had led not to loss, but to an unexpected expansion of family and love. 3 months later, the early October sunlight filtered through the windows of Frank Morrison's kitchen as Lila helped him prepare Sunday dinner. It had become their weekly tradition. Lila would arrive mid-morning, spend the day with Frank and Honey, and stay for dinner before heading home in the evening. Honey lay in her favorite spot by the kitchen window, her golden coat gleaming in the autumn light. She wore the brown leather collar Frank had given her, but today it was paired with the familiar leash that Lila had brought from home. The dog moved easily between both humans, accepting attention and affection from each, but clearly content to be in the house where she had spent her earliest years. "She looks so healthy," Lila observed, watching Honey stretch and yawn in the patch of sunlight. I think coming home has been good for her. Frank smiled as he stirred the pot of stew simmering on the stove. She settled in faster than I expected. The first week was a little rocky. She kept looking for you, especially in the evenings. But once she understood that you were still part of her life, just in a different way, she relaxed. The transition had indeed been easier than any of them had anticipated. True to his word, Frank had called Lila the day after bringing Honey home, and she had visited that very weekend. What she had found was a dog who was clearly happy to be back in familiar surroundings, but who also showed obvious joy when Lila arrived. "I have something to show you," Frank said, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. He led Lila to the living room, where a thick photo album sat open on the coffee table. "I've been working on this since Honey came home," Frank explained. "I wanted to create a record of her whole life, not just the years she spent with Margaret and me." Lila gasped as she saw the album. Frank had carefully arranged photographs chronologically, starting with pictures of Honey as a puppy in training, through her early years with Margaret, then a section titled The Missing Years, and finally, photographs from her life with Lila. "How did you get pictures of her life with me?" Lila asked, flipping through pages that showed Honey in Lila's backyard, sleeping on Lila's sofa, playing in the neighborhood park. "I asked if you had any photos you'd be willing to share," Frank said. "Dr. Ethan helped me contact you about it a few weeks ago. I hope you don't mind. I wanted the album to tell her complete story." Lila found herself looking at familiar images with new eyes. There was Honey's first Christmas with her, both of them wearing matching red scarves that Sarah had sent from Seattle. Another showed Honey supervising Lila's gardening, her intelligent eyes focused on her human's activities. A third captured Honey providing comfort during one of Lila's difficult days, her head resting in Lila's lap in the classic therapy dog position. "This is beautiful, Frank. It's like a visual timeline of all the people she's helped. Look at this page," Frank said, turning to a section near the end of the album. The page was titled New Family and contained recent photographs of Frank, Lila, and Honey together. There was one from Lila's first visit, showing all three of them in Frank's living room. Another from their second visit, when Lila had helped Frank with some yard work while Honey supervised. The most recent showed the three of them at Frank's kitchen table, sharing dinner like an extended family. "We look happy," Lila said softly, studying the images. "We are happy," Frank replied. "All of us." The arrangement that had evolved over the past 3 months worked better than anyone had expected. Lila visited every Sunday, and occasionally during the week when Frank needed help with appointments or errands. She had become not just Honey's visiting family member, but Frank's friend and companion in navigating the challenges of aging. In return, Frank had provided Lila with the sense of purpose and family connection she had been missing since her divorce. Helping care for Honey gave her a role that felt meaningful, and her friendship with Frank had evolved into something that enriched both their lives. "I have some news," Lila said as they returned to the kitchen to check on dinner. "Dr. Ethan called me yesterday about something interesting." "Oh?" "There's a family in town whose elderly father has early-stage dementia. They're looking for a therapy dog, and Dr. Ethan thought I might be interested in helping them find and train one." Frank's face lit up with understanding. "You want to help other families the way Honey helped Margaret and me and you." I've been thinking about it a lot. Honey taught me so much about how healing happens, how animals can help humans through their darkest times. Maybe I could use what I learned to help other people." "That's a wonderful idea," Frank said warmly. "And Lila, I think Honey would be proud to know that her influence is expanding beyond just the people she's directly touched." As if summoned by the sound of her name, Honey appeared in the kitchen doorway, tail wagging as she looked between her two favorite humans. She had filled out slightly since returning to Frank's care. no longer carrying the subtle stress that had marked her final months with Lila as the truth about her identity began to surface. "Come here, sweet girl," Lila called, and Honey immediately went to her, accepting the ear scratches and gentle words that had been part of their routine for 5 years. "You know what I realized the other day?" Frank said, watching the interaction between Lila and Honey. Margaret was right in her letter. Honey wasn't lost all those years. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was trained to do. Helping someone who needed healing, Lila agreed. And now she's home, but she hasn't stopped helping. She's just expanded her circle to include all of us. After dinner, as they sat in Frank's living room with Honey stretched out across both their feet, Lila found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed since that routine veterinary visit 3 months ago. She had entered Dr. Ethan's clinic, expecting to hear about a simple fatty tumor, and had instead discovered that her entire life was built on a foundation she hadn't understood. But rather than destroying her world, the truth had led to something richer and more meaningful than what she had before. She still missed having Honey as her daily companion, but she had gained a friendship with Frank that filled a different kind of emptiness in her life. "Frank," she said as the evening wound down, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you think Margaret would approve of how this all worked out? Me being part of Honey's life, our friendship, the way we've all adapted?" Frank was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on Honey's back. "I think Margaret would be thrilled. She always believed that love multiplied when it was shared, that there was never a shortage of affection to go around. She would love knowing that Honey has 2 families who care about her instead of just one." As Lila prepared to leave that evening, she knelt down to say goodbye to Honey, a ritual that had evolved over their Sunday visits. Instead of the heartbreaking separations she had feared, these goodbyes had become gentle transitions with Honey, seeming to understand that Lila would return the following week. "See you next Sunday, sweet girl," Lila whispered, scratching behind Honey's ears. "Be good for Frank." Honey's tail wagged as she accepted a final pet. Then she settled back down in her favorite spot, content and secure in the knowledge that all her people were safe and happy. Driving home through the quiet streets of their small town, Lila found herself thinking about the future with optimism she hadn't felt in years. She had plans to meet with the family doctor Ethan had mentioned, to explore how she might help them navigate the process of finding and training a therapy dog. She had her weekly visits with Frank and Honey to look forward to. And perhaps most importantly, she had learned that doing the right thing, even when it required sacrifice, often led to blessings she couldn't have imagined. Sometimes the love of a dog really was the only thing that kept people whole when life fell apart. But sometimes Lila had learned that same love could bring people together in ways that created something even stronger than what any of them had before. Honey had found her way home at last, and in the process, she had helped all of them discover that family was not about ownership or possession, but about the choice to care for each other through whatever challenges life might bring. In the end, that was the greatest gift a therapy dog could offer, not just healing, but the reminder that love, when freely given and gratefully received, had the power to transform loss into hope and strangers into family.